So, how much did you think this week? How much did you think? George Bernard Shaw once made what a lot of people would consider a very insulting statement. He said, "Few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year. I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking once or twice a week." What did he mean by that? Was that an insult, or is it true? And if it is true, how could that be? Because our minds are working all the time. You're thinking right now. We're all thinking. So what did he mean? Well, what Shaw meant was not the normal activity that's going on in the mind about general thinking. He was talking about pondering the deeper issues of life. And in thinking about what he said, I think a case can be made that we humans do not spend a great deal of time pondering the deep issues of life. Perhaps one of the reasons for that is from an observation that Eleanor Roosevelt made one time. She said, "Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people." Maybe that's because we're steered in that direction a lot. So much of what people talk about and engage others in, so much of what we see around us, let's say entertainment, television, books, magazines, movies, even what a lot of people call the news, steers us toward things and people and events, the physical. Interesting things temporarily, but not very deep. And it's really a shame because probably the greatest part of God's physical creation is the human mind. It is an amazing thing, this human mind that we have. And to be able to use its capacity fully and tap into its real potential is something that really often isn't done. And when it is, a lot of times it is misguided in its thinking by the influences of the surrounding world. On the other hand, to try to get people to think more is a little scary because it's bad thinking that has gotten everybody into the messes they're in to begin with. Sometimes I wonder if God ever says, "I just wish they would think more." No, wait a minute. That's what's gotten them there. They can't think because he did say a long time ago, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." That's in Isaiah 55 and verses 8 and 9. Our minds were made in God's image too. Marvelous creation. But God doesn't use his mind the way that humans do. Romans 8 and verse 7 says very clearly, the carnal mind is against God. And the way that the carnal mind works is contrary to God. He thinks differently. He uses his mind differently. And so for us humans to be on the same wavelength as God, we have to change our thinking because God isn't going to dumb down. We can be sure of that. God is not going to dumb down to the human level. But for us to be here today, for us to even be sitting here, God worked in our minds and made us think. He made us think differently. And we were willing. We displayed somehow a willingness to change our way of thinking through a process, number one, of learning new things, to going on to number two, to thinking about those new things, to number three, understanding those new things, the things of God. He put us on a new way of thinking about everything, and he designed that path to continue. Of all people, we should be thinkers. We should be thinkers because it is a core factor in conversion. It is the heart and core of conversion. In Romans chapter 12, Paul actually has quite a bit to say about thinking throughout his epistles. And in Romans 12 and verse 2, he said, "Do not be conformed to this world. Don't be like the world, but be transformed, be changed. Now, how are we changed? By the renewing of your mind. It's what goes on in the mind that is the key to being changed and being different from the world, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The change, the transforming, the conversion comes first in the way we think. Then our behavior follows. And that is also based on a simple principle in Proverbs 23:7, as he thinks in his heart, so is he. The thinking has to change before our behavior changes. Paul talked to the Corinthians about this, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. He makes a statement here that when you ponder it, you think, wow, how in the world can we accomplish this? In 2 Timothy 10 and verse 3, Paul wrote, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh." The battles we have are not physical. He goes on to say, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal." They're not of the flesh. But they are, he says, mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. As we think about the days of unleavened bread, preparing for the Passover, we probably considered some of the things that have strongholds on us that we are trying to break. As we go to Pentecost, we think about the Spirit of God that gives us the power and strength to break those things. But there are strongholds. And then he describes in verse 5, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. This war that is in the mind, we have to think about our thinking, because that's where the battles are won and lost. It's the Isaiah 55 factor. My thoughts are not your thoughts. But when our thoughts can become God's thoughts, that's when we win the battles against the flesh. But to bring every thought into captivity, how in the world? Every thought. How in the world can we do this? This is a huge challenge. But today I want to cover one aspect of how to move our minds toward having God's thoughts be our thoughts. There are so many things in the Bible about thinking, and we could go into detail on any number of them, but I want to focus on this one area. One of the best ways to do this is one in which so few people engage in consistently or constructively. Again, the Bible is full of instruction about thinking, the heart, the mind, attitude, all these processes that go on inside of our brains. And it has a lot to say about what is probably the most powerful tool we can use to govern our thinking. And it's also perhaps one of the most overlooked ways to draw close to God. It is a biblical term, but if you used it today out in the public, most people would probably think of Eastern or New Age religions. That term is meditation. Meditation. You don't hear a lot today about meditation, except in that context of New Agey type stuff. I'll give you an example. I did an internet search about this and came across a few gems of wisdom, such as this about meditation. One said, "The goal of meditation is not to control your thoughts. It's to stop letting them control you." Look at that. Say what? The goal of meditation is not to control your thoughts, but to get them to stop controlling you. Okay. Another one said, "True meditation has no direction or goal. It is pure, wordless surrender, pure, silent prayer." What is wordless surrender? I don't know what that means. How can prayer be with no direction? A third one said, the purpose of meditation, I like this, simply for its absurdity. The purpose of meditation is soul contact and ultimately union with the soul. Its whole object is to enable one to become in outer manifestation what one is in inner reality. I don't completely know what that means, but all I know is inner reality for most people is not what they need to become in all their outside behavior. You think we're in a mess now? Wait until people stop controlling what's their inner reality. That's not what meditation is in the Bible. In the Bible, meditation means controlled thinking, guided thinking, with direction, to contemplate, to muse, to ponder, to study. I think that's what George Bernard Shaw meant when he said few people engage in it more than 2 or 3 times a year. Why would that be? When our minds are active continually, when our minds are going all the time, why is it that so few people engage in that kind of deep thought? Maybe Henry Ford hit on part of it when he said, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is why so few people engage in it. Maybe he had a point. He was hitting on something that is core to the nature of most people. Humans tend to either be mentally lazy, or we tend to work very hard at being busy so that our minds are always going on something other than the deeper things of life. Meditation will suffer from either extreme. You can't be mentally lazy, and you can't be so busy that you can't give time to it and have meditation work. Meditation, deep thinking, requires an environment. It needs quiet, uninterrupted time where you can work on focusing, concentrating. It's very easy not to find that time. It's easy to get so busy, to get caught up in things to do, socializing, working, burning the midnight oil. And after a while, time passes and you realize, I have not been giving time to deep, reflective thought. Meditation does not grow well in the soil of exhaustion or busyness. Meditation does not grow well in the soil of exhaustion or busyness. Meditation is probably one of the first victims of the cares of this life. When Jesus warned in Luke 21:34 about the end-time factors that will weigh the heart down, he said there will be carousing, drunkenness, and this general phrase, the cares of this life. And the cares of this life can be so many and so active that meditation, the time to meditate, the ability to meditate, is eroded. Now, besides laziness and busyness preventing meditation, there's another reason why a lot of people don't do it. It's painful. It can be painful. The author James Thurber said, 60 minutes of thinking of any kind is bound to lead to confusion and unhappiness. Now, he was a humorist. Well, that's pretty dark. But that was his worldview. And that's not a new worldview, that it's painful at times. Because a lot of the things to think about, the big issues in life for most humanity, don't have big answers. They don't have answers. In fact, there was a time in one of the psalmists' life, Asaph, we'll come to this later, in Psalm 73, he was thinking about the unfairness of life. And he said, when I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me. That's a man writing in the Bible. When I tried to understand it, it was too painful for me. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1:13, I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under the heaven, this grievous task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. And the Hebrew word can mean afflicted. Solomon looked on it as an affliction, and what follows is Solomon's frustration of thinking about life. You might think, well, the big lesson in Ecclesiastes is about searching out wisdom and thinking. No, the big lesson is the danger of thinking solo, S-O-L-O, thinking alone without God, trying to find answers and thinking about life apart from the knowledge of understanding of God. And that's where Solomon was going, and it was so frustrating to him. But we need to be aware. Something very dangerous happens when we don't work hard to think. When we don't work hard to meditate, or if we resist meditation because it's hard or painful, something dangerous happens. We turn our thinking over to others. We turn our thinking over to others. If we don't control where our thinking goes, we will just open our minds to all sorts of things that are being thought of and expressed in the world today. It's easy to listen to others, to watch others, to read others, and all of that can easily fill the mind with things that are either shallow and worth nothing, therefore they produce nothing, or stuff that is destructive, and that produces sin. It's part of understanding. This is Satan's world, and Satan wants to drive the bus. Satan wants to do our thinking for us. He wants to put thoughts in the mind. He wants to steer our thinking. And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. When you read the story of Adam and Eve, that's what he started doing. He started planting thoughts. And then Adam and Eve started chewing on those thoughts a little bit. And you know where it took them. Christ was very careful to guard against this. When we read that he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin, we usually don't consider that living in this world, he faced the same challenges that we do about thinking. And he did deal with it, though. And he dealt with it consciously and successfully. Let's go to Mark 6. Mark 6. I gave this first about a month ago because I found myself frustrated at not having time to sit down and really think. We had a conference coming up. We needed to think about the presentations, and it just seemed like every day at work, there's just so much going on, and you finish the day and you go home exhausted, and all you want to do is veg. And that means mentally relax. And it was building and building. We just needed time to think, and I think everybody was in that boat. Sometimes it puts your mind there that I really need some time to think. In Mark 6 and verse 30, it says, "The apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, 'Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while.' For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat." Sometimes you have to get by yourself at the right place just to stop and rest. So much going on. Verse 32, "So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities, and they arrived before them and came together to him." You ever feel in life like some things just won't let you rest? Sometimes the items on my to-do list run on foot from all over, and they're waiting for me whenever I arrive, where it is I want to go. And that's what they found out. They were trying to get by themselves and rest, and there was just no relief. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So, what did he do? He began to teach them. He did the things that needed to be done. Sometimes there are a lot of things that just need to be done legitimately. Verse 35, "When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late.'" And here's their solution: "Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. Their solution was to ignore their needs. His solution was to take care of their needs. So he performed a miracle. He fed them miraculously. You can read about that through verse 44, 5,000 of them. We come to verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountains to pray. At this point, he even needed to get away from the disciples. He just needed to be by himself. He took a break to think, to pray, to plan. When you read ahead, later you will find he went back to work. More people flooded around him, and it included people seeking to learn, and it included people seeking to accuse him. He was having to deal with attacks. I have no doubt that in his human experience, him being a human being, that he needed time away to do the things necessary to prepare for what was coming, all the things of life. But what we find in this account here in Mark chapter 6 are two critical concepts about the mind. Number one is making time to think and to be in an environment that makes good thinking possible. And number two was to think in the right direction. It says that he went to pray. Prayer is based on thinking. We talk with God what we're thinking about. We think as we talk to God. Now let's consider for a moment that first point about making the right time and environment to make good thinking possible. Christ, it says, he went to the mountain. He went up to the mountain. I think he understood the way the mind works. Not only do you get away from people, you get out into creation. One of the best things for meditation is to get out in God's creation where you don't contend with the radio, the television, the iPhone, the barking dogs, the four walls around you, all the things that are so distracting. Why is nature so good? Those of you at the church campout a few years ago may remember this story. Some years back, I was backpacking with a friend up in the Sierras, and we were on about a 20-mile, 3-day hike. And we got into a conversation, and he said something that made all the sense in the world to me. He said, "Did you ever notice when you're taking a walk in the woods or strolling down the beach or, just sitting by a lake, how peaceful it is? Your mind becomes peaceful. Any kind of natural environment, that it does something for your mind." He said, "We're here walking and we're doing a lot of physical exercise. We're huffing and puffing, but there's just a peace." He said, I said, "Yeah." He said, "You ever think of why that is?" I said, "No." And he said, "I have a theory." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I think we think better in nature because we are in a lawful environment." When you're in nature, when you're in the woods, when you're by the beach, you are watching. Everything you see is working according to law. It's laws that God created, laws of physics, laws of nature. You're in God's environment. You're not in the city. You're not in man's environment. You're not around people who are law-breaking, who aren't thinking right. You're in an environment that works according to law, and where law exists, there is peace. It's a principle. Where law exists, there is order, there is logic, there is peace. You don't even think about it. It's just there. You don't have to think about it, but that setting has an environmental effect that is just conducive to a settledness of mind, and that creates a better environment to think. I do believe that's one reason why God gave us the Sabbath, so we can collect our thoughts better. So we can get away from all the things not only that we've been thinking about, not only working, but thinking about in our daily routines, and have a setting in which we can relax. We can train ourselves to relax. We can set aside time to meditate. That Sabbath is wonderful. We're in baseball season now, and I really like the game. I read a book a few years ago by George Will called Men at Work. It's about baseball. And he made the statement in there, he said, some people say they don't like baseball because it's too slow. He said, but when you understand the game and all the things that are going on at every position, on every pitch, every play, coaches will tell you it's too fast. They don't have time to think about all the strategies for everything that can hinge on a particular play. I think the Sabbath is the same way. When you come into God's way of life and you start keeping the Sabbath, it seems so slow. You don't know, how am I going to pass this 24 hours doing this? But as you have the years go by and you learn more and more about God's way, you come to the conclusion the Sabbath is too fast. I don't have enough time to think about all the things I would like to think about. But it's the best time we have. It's the best time to start developing the habit of meditation. Christ recognized the need for time and place. The second factor, lesson from this Mark 30 description, is the discipline to think in the right direction. The discipline to think in the right direction. He went to pray. And again, prayer is based on thinking. We think as we talk to God, if it's effective prayer. So what do we find about thinking in the right direction? One of the most fundamental instructions in the Bible is found in Philippians chapter 4. In Philippians 4, again, Paul, who obviously was a very deep thinker, Philippians 4 and verse 8, Paul said, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble. I'm not going to elaborate on these things. They would be very good things to study and just try to focus on what do each of these things mean. Whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. You notice the overall theme to everything mentioned here? Every one of these things is positive. These are all positive things. Now, did Paul mean, don't ever let your mind consider anything negative? Don't let any negative thought come in. Well, no, that's unrealistic. That's impossible. You watch the news. You pick up the paper. You talk to somebody. You go to the store. And you will be exposed to a lot of negative things. That's not what he was talking about. We have to think about the full spectrum of life. Paul talked himself about negative things. We have to think about the full spectrum of life, but this instruction here has to do with what we might call directional thinking. By that, I mean it's the direction we should go to. It's the place we should end up. We should go in this direction. What direction am I going to go with my thinking? And he says, meditate on these things. Bring these things into the picture of your life. Meditate on these things. Some people allow the direction of virtually all their thoughts to go spiraling downward in the wrong direction. They focus on the worst case scenarios, the negative, the arguments that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. But this tells us to always take our thoughts to the constructive. Are you in a bad situation? We'll all be there from time to time. He's telling us, don't abandon thoughts about faith. All these things that he lists here, Don't abandon your thoughts. Meditate on these things. Bring them into the picture of your life. Even the most negative situations, proper meditation can redirect our thoughts in the right way. Back in 2013, I gave a sermon here about the 4 enemies of faith, and I told a story that may be worth recounting at this point about how our thinking can just get locked in, and we just need a little help sometimes to change our way of thinking. A lady called one time, and she was in a dire financial trial, and it was truly bad. She was in a bad situation, and she was worried, and she was fretting. She was consumed with it, and she was panicked. And it was one of those calls that as soon as they start, you realize, okay, I'm just going to have to listen for a while. So about 15 minutes in, she was pouring out her heart about her fears, and she was truly anguished. But I realized, there comes a point where you have to take control of the conversation a little bit. So I insisted that she stopped and listened to me. I said, let me ask you a few questions. While she'd been speaking, I'd been writing down some questions, and they were progressive questions in that they were questions designed to progress from one thought to another. They were not random. So she stopped, and I said, answer this for me. Does God exist? Yeah, but what does that have to do with No. Just answer my question. Does God exist? Well, yes. Is the Bible His Word? Yes. Did Christ die for you? Yes. Did you die for Him through repentance and baptism? Yes. Do you have His Holy Spirit? Yes. If you died today, would you be resurrected and be in His kingdom? Yes. Does God know your situation today? Yes. Did He promise He would never leave you or forsake you? Yes. Did David say, I've never seen the seed of the righteous begging for bread? Yes. Do you have a congregation here that you are part of as a family and they are your friends and support? Yes. Have you been working hard, doing everything you can in this situation? Yes. Do you know how you're going to pay your bills? No. Do you think God can find a way? Yes. The conversation did not change her situation, but her thinking took on a totally different tone and direction. As we talked, a calm settled over her, and sometimes you just got to break that panicky feeling that consumes our thinking. And just thinking about some other issues brought her situation into a different perspective. The enemy was being beaten back. The tide had turned. Her faith was returning a little bit, and she was out of panic mode. And at the end of the questions, I told her, while we've been talking, I've written a check for you out of the church's assistance fund. It's already in the envelope. I'm going to put it in the mail as soon as we finish here on the phone. And she had great relief come over her. But what if our conversation had started with, had totally focused on, and had never moved away from, do you know how you're going to pay your bills? That's where we would have been stuck. That's where she was. She was on that worry, and there were no answers. There was no other way to think about it. It had consumed her thinking. Worry thinking prevents us from putting God into the picture. And what happens then? All the faith questions start to come. The faith starts to be chipped away at the edges. We don't think about and answer the big questions. Does God know? Does God care? Let's put our minds on the big picture and then work back toward the situation I'm dealing with. You will often find that godly meditation changes your thought direction. Godly meditation often changes your thought direction. It puts you back into the larger picture of what is God doing. Once you have the big picture, you can work your way back to the smaller things. But if all you're thinking about is the smaller things, you'll never get to the big picture. And it puts life out of perspective. I was sympathetic to that lady. You know why? Because I'd been in her shoes before. We've all been there. We've all been in her shoes. I knew where she was mentally because of having been there. I was able to tell her what to do because of having learned some things previously through that hard path of life. We all go there from time to time. Sometimes we need an outside-in view of things to help us with our thinking. That's often what counseling is for. You know, all that counseling is really just helping us think about something in a little different way, sometimes in a big different way. But that's what counseling is to help us think about things that we might not have thought of on our own. Now, let me digress here. I know that all problems are not solved as easily as hers was, writing a check. That would be nice, wouldn't it? I'm not naive enough to know that some trials are long and some trials we just have to endure. I often think of how Ephesians 6:13 is worded, where it says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Sometimes you've done all you can do, and all you can do is stand. You ever been there? You ever been to where you've done all you can do, and now you're just standing until the storm passes? But remember this: while we stand, we think. We think. And the way we think will affect the strength with which we stand. Proverbs 16:3 says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established." Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established. The commitment comes first. It doesn't say, well, when your thoughts are established, then you can commit your works to God. It's not the way it works. It says, commit your works to God, and your thoughts will be established. That means sometimes going to God and being completely honest, telling God, I've got these problems and I am struggling. I'm struggling with worry. My faith is being attacked, but I am committed to following you, and I know that you're committed to me. Make that commitment. Commit your works to God. When you commit your works to God, then you look for other ways to think. You look at examples of these things mentioned here, things that are true, things that are noble, things that are of good report. What have you heard in your Christian life? What stories have you heard about others? What things have you gone through that you can report in the past that was good, where God intervened on your behalf? Go to the stockpile of all the stories of where God has led, God has guided, God has intervened. This Christian life that we walk is a growing compilation of experiences, your own experiences, other people's experiences, that are all chapters in this book that God is writing about His people. And throughout that, the single thread is how God works in the lives of people, His people. Commit your works to God, and your thoughts will be established. You can think on those things. You can meditate on those things. One of the writers referred to this earlier in Psalm 73. Asaph learned this. Let's go to Psalm 73. This is a remarkably, what would you call it, a self-exposing. I mean, he writes about something that a lot of us perhaps would not want to write about and admit. But it's a bit of a confession of something that he went through in his life. But it offers some great insight to the thinking process that we can all fall into. Psalm 73. Asaph starts out and he says, "Truly God is good to Israel, to such as are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. What was the problem? What was Asaph struggling with? He said, for I was envious of the boastful. Envy comes from thinking. It's the only thing that envy comes from. Envy can only come from the way we think. Thinking wrongly. I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. It's so easy to go there. He saw something. Then he started thinking about it. But his thinking went down the wrong path. He got stuck on one way of seeing a situation. Well, then it goes on to describe what he was thinking about the wicked. And I won't read through all of these verses, but he's basically saying nothing ever happens to them. They get away with everything. They don't even acknowledge God, and nothing happens, and he was just getting worse and worse. He was meditating all right, but he was stuck in a rut of seeing one thing one way, and it was not the Philippians 4:8 model. So in verse 13, he even reached the point of feeling sorry for himself about trying to follow God. He said, surely I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I've been plagued. Now he gets into the pity party. Not only are they doing fine, but I'm suffering. I'm chastened every morning. And then he realized if I had said, I will speak thus, well, he said, I would have been untrue to the generation of your children. Verse 16, when I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me. Now that's a bad place to be in life. That's a bad place to end up in your thinking progression. But something changes. Verse 17, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. Nothing changed in the whole situation of the world except his thinking. And that made all the difference in the world for him. It brought him out of nearly stumbling. Steps had nearly slipped. He then goes on to describe how he thought differently now about the same things that had frustrated him so terribly earlier. There's a great lesson here. He went to the sanctuary of God. One of the great benefits of meditating, and I'll talk about this momentarily, with the mind of God and in the shadow of God's word, God's thoughts, is that it helps us to walk around an issue and start seeing it from different angles than where we were normally seeing it, not get stuck. If I'm looking at this microphone and this is all I see of it, I'm only going to see part of it. But when I start walking around it and looking at it from different perspectives, that's the way life is. All situations we can see in different perspectives and we don't get stuck. And so when you sit on your patio at night and you're looking up at the stars and you're talking to God and you're not having any interference from outside things and you're thinking and you pray and you think to God and you ask God, is this it? Is this the only way to see this situation? Are there other things I should be thinking about? Are there other ways to understand this? We think, we ponder, and in that right environment, in the right mind, we ask God, help me think. Help me think. And we start meditating on all sides of the issue. And God leads us, like he did Asaph, to the right understanding. It's a great psalm describing how two trains of thought went through one person's mind. He had jumped on that negative train with narrow tunnel vision, very destructive. But eventually he got on the right train of thought. What did he do? He went to the sanctuary of God. What does that mean? Well, I think it means exactly what Christ did. Set some time aside, went to the right place to be with God in prayer, and that affected his thinking. A few verses later, he even records some thoughts about his thoughts. Verse 21, thus my heart was grieved and I was vexed in my mind. I was so foolish and ignorant. I was like a beast before you. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold me by my right hand. You will guide me with your counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. It's very important. Let's turn back a few pages to Psalm 55. Psalm 55. This is a song of David. And in verse 17, David said, evening and morning and at noon, I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. The word pray is an interesting Hebrew word. It's siyak, S-I-Y-A-C-H, we would spell it in English. It means to ponder. Literally means to ponder. It can mean, by implication, to converse, and it can even mean to converse with one's self. You know, you're just talking with yourself. It can mean to utter, to commune, complain, declare, meditate, muse, pray, speak, talk with. It's the same word we find in Genesis 24:63, where it says Isaac went out to meditate in the field at eventime. It's the same word you find translated 5 times in Psalm 119. It's translated into English as meditate. And here he says, I will pray. It is also translated, I will bow down to meditate. It links prayer with thinking. Prayer is an excellent time, not only for talking with God, but for thinking with God. That's another reason why prayer is important. Prayer gives us time to think. There's nothing wrong with pausing in your prayer sometimes just to think. In fact, asking God, help me to think, should be a part of our prayer regularly. Let's go to Psalm 19. We'll stay for a while here in the book of Psalms. Psalm 19. Verse 14. Psalm 19:14, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. The words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts, at times of prayer especially, are so important. And we ask God, let that be acceptable. The psalmist here was basically saying, help me to think. Let the meditation of my heart be right. Help me to think. God is not the author of confusion. God will answer that prayer if we ask him. In Psalm 139, verse 23, David said, search me, know my heart, try me, know my anxieties. See if there's any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. It's so important to ask God, help me to think. Just help me to think right. One of the greatest works of God's Spirit is to guide our thinking. We're not on autopilot when we get converted, you know. We still have to fight that carnal mind, and we have to have our mind steered in the right direction. Let's look at some other principles here in Psalms about meditation. First and foremost, the Psalms are full of the greatest topic to think about, to meditate on. Beginning in Psalm 1. We sang this earlier. I think it was one of the middle song, the fourth song we sang. Psalm 1. Blessed is the man, verse 1, who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. The margin in the New King James says, ponders. He thinks about that. He ponders by talking. It says ponders by talking to himself. Thinking about the law of God, the ways of God, God's guidelines, how to apply the law. Thinking about problems, causes, and solutions that relate to the law of God. Thinking about cause and effect and how the law of God governs everything. Principles of life, give and get, and all of these different ways of looking at God's way and the laws of life. Psalms begins with that very principle of thinking about, meditating on the ways of God, and it is throughout the book. Let's go to chapter 119. Psalm 119, verse 15. Psalm 119, 15, I will meditate on your precepts and contemplate your ways. The word contemplate in the margin says, look into. I'm going to think about your precepts and meditate on your precepts and contemplate, look into your ways. I will delight myself in your statutes. I will not forget your word. It's steering the thinking. It's directional thinking, steering the direction of our thoughts toward God's word, God's way of life. In verse 23, princes also sit and speak against me, but your servant meditates on your statutes. Remember Eleanor Roosevelt's quote, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people. Princes sit and talk about me. That's where their minds were, talking about David. But he said, I'm going to think about God. I'm going to think about God's precepts. In trials, David was apparently in a time of trial. When princes are sitting and speaking against you, you've probably got some problems lurking on the horizon. Times of trial are the times to focus on God. Verse 48, my hands also I will lift up to your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. Again, what is God telling us to do? What is David's example here? Laws, precepts, statutes, that which is of God, God's way, having that direct our thinking. You know, so often emotions direct our thinking. Emotions push our thoughts in certain directions. And we've all experienced that too. Have you ever thought about issues and realized that my emotions have entered in and my emotions have sort of overruled common sense? And then you back away from that emotional thinking and you can see more clearly. Meditating on God's statutes takes the mind off of our emotions and helps us to think more logically, spiritually. Verse 97, oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. Thinking through the day, how to apply. If you find you have trouble thinking about God's law, being consistent in that way, what's the first thing to do? Ask Him for help. Just go to God and say, hey, I need help. Help me to think. Help me to be more aware. Help me to train my mind to focus on your law. Hold your finger here. He says, it's my meditation all the day. Keep your finger here in Psalm 119, but go back to chapter 63. Chapter 63. And verse 6. David said, when I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. He's gone to bed. He's lying down to go to sleep. And he said, I remember you and I think about you. What a great habit to try to think and pray at night before going to sleep, to turn your mind toward God. I remember being surprised one time decades ago when I heard Mr. Armstrong say, I try to fall asleep praying. Fall asleep praying? That's a little disrespectful, isn't it? That was my initial thought. Well, if Mr. Beach had fallen asleep giving the opening prayer, yes, that would have been disrespectful. If you fall asleep at dinner asking the meal on the blessing on the meal, that's probably disrespectful. But as I thought about it, you know, the last thing at night, to be lying in bed, to be ending your day, by thinking and talking with God, having that be the last thing on your mind before you drift off to sleep. I don't think that's disrespectful. I think that's being my meditation all the day. Just God's on your mind. Every married couple knows what it's like to be lying there just sort of talking, and then you just sort of drift off to sleep. And that's not disrespecting your mate. But the principle in Psalm 119, all the day, that's where my mind is going. Back to Psalm 119, verse 98. You, through your commandments, make me wiser than my enemies. The wisdom does not come just by knowing the Ten Commandments. It comes by the thinking that we put into the Ten Commandments, all of the commandments. For they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all of my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the ancients, because I keep your precepts. I have restrained my feet from every evil way that I may keep your word. When you put these several verses together here about meditating on these things all the day, his testimonies are my meditation. And then he says, I restrain my feet from doing evil. A lot of people get in trouble because they have not thought in advance about the things that would help them to choose to restrain their feet from evil when the temptation comes. They haven't thought about that well enough in advance. In fact, what is the phrase you hear so often when someone is dealing with the after effects of having done something stupid? What's the phrase we often hear? Well, I just wasn't thinking. That's right. We weren't thinking. The most important thinking that affects our actions is often not the thinking that we have to do at the time of temptation, but it's the thinking that was done well in advance. Thinking about the things of God, having our minds there before decision time comes, having thought some things through. Thinking deeply about the things of God today may well settle your mind of what you're tempted to do on Wednesday next week. It has that effect. That's what David was saying. I meditate on these things, and I restrain my feet from evil ways. Verse 102, I have not departed from your judgments, for you yourself have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through your precepts I get understanding. Therefore, something mental goes on. I hate every false way. We don't hate every false way unless we're thinking about the precepts that give us understanding. That's why the meditation on this is so important. Let's go back to verse 59. Verse 59. I thought about my ways. I thought about my ways and turned my feet to your testimonies. This is why that works. We think about God, His ways, we think about our ways, we meditate on these things, and then we act in a certain way. We turn our feet to His testimonies. We apply the laws of God to our own lives. Again, there are many ways to reflect on the laws of God. The letter and the spirit, cause and effect, problem, cause, and solution, what works, what doesn't work, and why. All of these things go into thinking about God's law. What else is there to think about in terms of meditation? Well, meditation should be something that we regularly do, but there are a couple of places in the Psalms that touch very powerfully on some of the most important times for meditation, and one of the most important subjects for meditation when we are in those times. There are some spots in life that occasionally come up that are more dangerous to us than other times. They present dangers. And those are times often of stress and trouble. They all come on us as we go through life. And these are times when we have to be very careful in our thinking. Let's go to Psalm 143. Psalm 143, verse 4. David was in one of these times, Psalm 143, 4. And he said, "Therefore, my spirit is overwhelmed within me, and my heart within me is distressed." Feeling overwhelmed, being distressed is a dangerous time. We're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to wrong thinking. But then he said in verse 5, "I remember the days of old. I meditate on all your works. I muse on the work of your hands. I spread out my hands to you. My soul longs for you like a thirsty land." It's a time of reflection. I remember the days of old. In other words, we look backwards in order to see ahead. We look backwards in order to see ahead. We remember days of old, and it helps us have confidence in what God is going to do. God often answers our prayers by simply helping us think. And David was thinking here in a godly way when his spirit was overwhelmed and his heart was distressed. You know, when we ask for inspiration, you know what we're asking for? We're simply asking for God, help me to think. Help me to think like you. Job 32:8 says, "There is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty gives them understanding." All I'm saying is that meditation gives God time to meditate, gives God some fertile soil to work in giving us inspiration. So David prayed that way. There was a time when this really paid off. Psalm 77. Psalm 77. This is a psalm of Asaph. Psalm 77 and verse 1. Again, he's very open. He's an open book about the way he was feeling about things. And he writes here, beginning in verse 1, "I cried out to God with my voice, to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled." You know, well, it's not supposed to work like that. Well, sometimes it takes a little bit. Sometimes it takes a little while to work through things. "I remembered God and was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search." He came to some questions to ask. Will the Lord cast off forever? No. Will he be favorable no more? No, that's not the way God is. Has his mercy ceased forever? No. Has his promise failed forevermore? No. Has God forgotten to be gracious? No. Has he in anger shut up his tender mercies? No. These are the questions and thinking that come to mind, but there are also other things to think about. And here he says, I need to remember some things. And he thinks about the past. He thinks about what's happened before, and he asks himself these bigger questions of life. In verse 10, I said, "This is my anguish, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all of your work and talk of your deeds. Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? You are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength among the peoples. You have, with your arm, redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. There's a big element of faith that you see building in his life here. We will be troubled. We see people all the time with troubles, but some handle it so much differently than others do. And the key is in the way we think. God's thoughts create stability. God's thoughts create faith. Faith, either having it or not having it, has everything to do with the way we're thinking. Brethren, God has given us this most marvelous creation of the mind, and in that mind is the spirit in man, and two amazing functions take place in this mind. Number one, we're able to collect and store information. And number two, we're able to process it and determine what we will do with our lives. And that mind is a marvelous tool, but without the Spirit of God influencing it, it's a dangerous tool. It can take us wrong places. God tells us, use this mind, use this marvelous creation that I've given you, but do it in the right way. Misguided thinking is fatal. Guided thinking, meditating, is tremendous. It opens the door to godly living. It goes hand in hand with prayer. It goes hand in hand with talking to God, but making the time to think about God. And God will establish your thoughts. I quoted George Bernard Shaw and Eleanor Roosevelt and Henry Ford. Let me quote one of the most famous statements about thinking. René Descartes, the French philosopher, said, "I think, therefore I am." And look at where we are. God lifts us to a higher plane. God says, think like I think, and therefore you can be like I am.